Good evening. You're watching BOUS TV. It's now time for the Hobby Hour with your host, Mr. Farson. Blasted ruins line the streets as weary defenders take cover behind piles of rubble and blown out hab units. Tanks rumble down cratered streets before being ambushed by hidden infantry. City fights are an iconic backdrop to some of our favourite stories in the 30k universe, and are now generally the default setting for games of 30k and 40k, but this wasn't always the case. Previous editions of 40k have City Fight specific supplements that contained unique rules for playing in urban environments. And in much the same vein as my Planet Strike supplement, I've updated these rules for 30k. But as ever, let's go back to the distant past of this presenter's ill-remembered childhood and look back at the history of urban warfare in the far future. Prior to 4th edition, gaming tables for 40k were a remarkably lush affair. Green grass mats alongside forests and rocky outcrops were a staple of the far future. What man-made structures were present were usually small corner ruins and scattered buildings or redoubts, with the occasional industrial site lurking. Much of this terrain was scratch built, but GW did produce a limited number of cardstock terrain kits. Big up the Storm of Vengeance power plant, by the way. This all began to change in the 3rd edition 40k release. City Fight originally released in 3rd Ed 40k. A relatively small book, it presented a number of suggested rules alterations to the game for playing games in an urban setting. Nearly all of the terrain in the book was scratch built, with a few exceptions in the form of resin terrain that would eventually be sold by Forge World. Remember when Forge World sold more than 30k units? I sure do. The rules in City Fight were more limited in scope compared to the later iterations, and the book really functioned as an inspirational piece to get you to model a table. I have some really fond memories of this book, but in terms of gaming content, it's not fantastic. The launch of 4th edition 40k expanded the limited terrain rules of 3rd Ed, and from the get-go featured more urban environments in promotional material. In addition, more urban settings would be featured in the build-up to the Cities of Death release, and an editorial would be written in White Dwarf around 3 months prior to its dropping about how 40k was actually brown and grey and not green. That issue we were graced with 3 battle reports set in the 41st millennium, including an Inquisitor one from memory. Cities of Death hit with a bang in the summer of 2006. Alongside the book itself, 3 brand new terrain kits were released alongside an urban gaming map made out of paper, resin stratagem markers, and most importantly, a vinyl roll of road, which was the best goddamn thing ever and is an absolute nightmare to get hold of nowadays. And there is no product which even comes close to it in a modern representation, and I'm fuming that I don't have one and someone needs to sell me one, for real. On a side note, you used to be able to find prototype sprues for the Cities of Death buildings up on eBay quite frequently, which was kind of cool. The Cities of Death book presented a wide array of missions and rules for a gamer. The missions were broadly split into 2 categories: battle missions, your more traditional match play affair, and narrative missions, which varied in scope wildly. A particular favourite of mine was the narrative mission Thunder Run, where the attacker starts on a short board edge and has to make it off the opposite short board edge. The defender's deployment zone is everything on either side of a small column in the centre of the battlefield, which meant the entire time the attacker was pushing forward, they were getting shot in their side armour. Absolutely quality. Alongside these missions were a number of stratagems for the attacker and defender to use. This is to my knowledge the first use of stratagems within the GW rule system, and some of which are still in use to this day in a bit of a modified form. Plunging Fire, for example, first appeared in Cities of Death and is now being featured in several editions, including the most modern edition to my knowledge. Getting a Cities of Death game together was quite difficult during Forfeit due to the cost involved in assembling a suitable board. Most GWs at the time only really had a single urban board available, which would nearly always be in use and getting fought over by the regulars. Home gaming was also out of the question for my teenage self with Cities of Death due to the prohibitive cost of the terrain requirement. And as a result, this supplement didn't really make too much of an impact on my gaming life. In 7th edition, the expansion received an update and was rolled into the Planetary Onslaught book. Stratagems and the more narrative missions were removed from this book, and the number of buildings needed more defined. In some ways, this was a good thing, as we could frequently play this as pickup games with randoms at our local store. There was a linked campaign system introduced in this book, which ran through a 6-campaign setup with attackers and defenders gaining bonuses throughout the missions depending on the previous victories. The 7th ed version of Cities of Death is the variant I've updated for use with 30k, due to the base similarities in the rules. So what's the difference to a core book mission? In Cities of Death, you'll generate objectives at the start of the game to achieve for your secondaries, and as you score them, you'll generate them more at the start of your turn. These range from kill a particular unit type, a rather broad selection than specific, to claim a particular objective, or assault a unit in cover. They're generic enough to be achievable no matter what faction you're playing against, and specific enough that each game feels different. Alongside these objectives, your primary objective will vary depending on which of the 6 missions you play. A particular favourite of mine is High Ground, a mission where you need to control the 2 highest points on the battlefield. Tally up how many times those buildings change ownership during the game. All you need to do now is download the PDF, slap some terrain down, and you can wage war across your very own urban hellscape. Got a printer? I'd recommend Saccomandus Terrain to get that warscape going. So if any of the above sounds like something you'd be interested in, please do take a look in my description for the link to the PDF, and if you'd be so kind, like and subscribe.
And now, the weather here on BOUS TV.